All right, today I have Miss Sakina Tennyson with me. And Miss Tennyson, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into today's topic?
Okay, so I am actually from Michigan. I am a business strategist and a therapist, so two very interesting things that I do. And I focus specifically on helping early stage entrepreneurs and inspiring entrepreneurs to create an exit strategy so that they can start their businesses and create it around their life so that they can enjoy their life because that's something that I really value.
All right, very important work. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So today's topic is obviously a sensitive one, and especially thinking of the context we're talking to fellow believers, and you being a therapist and the work that you do. Um, what overall, what do you think about where we are as Christians, or our perspective on suicide, and what have you observed, and what are some things that you think are important for us as Christians to consider when we think of suicide?
Wow, this is a big topic, especially just experiencing it personally. And immediately, what comes to mind is that we have to not be afraid to talk about it while everybody's still living, right? So we don't talk about it enough because people are often thinking about suicide. It's not uncommon for at least some point in a lot of people's lives that the thought crosses their mind, especially if they know somebody who's committed suicide. Because one of the things that happens is once it happens within a family or a friendship, it's not uncommon for someone connected to repeat it because now they see it as an option. So, one of the first things I would say is that we have to not be afraid to talk about it. And I don't know if maybe we think that it'll go away. Another thing I would say is really important to stop saying to people in the ways that we do that your loved one may not be in the kingdom or make it to the kingdom later, whatever it is that you believe about how that all goes down. But what's most important is that people know that God loves them, God loves their loved one that took their life. God loves you if you're thinking about it, and that doesn't change. We don't really dictate God's love. He's not limited to our perspective. And I don't believe that we're more compassionate than God is. And so we have to really get into our spirits hope for people who are suffering through the loss of a loved one or are thinking about it rather than fear, because fear just pushes a person towards, you know, aloneness. They don't feel as comfortable opening up because now you're projecting your fear of what their choice might be. You're projecting your fears of losing them, totally normal, but fear doesn't help a person change their mind.
Wow, so many powerful points. One of the things that you mentioned earlier, as you just responded, you mentioned talking about it while people are still alive, and that I don't know, something about that just hit me in a different way. And then you added the fear piece, and that people don't change their minds because of fear, right? And that we're not more compassionate than God. That's those are very helpful. um we were talking earlier about the experience of Job, and how a lot of times in the church we know the story of Job. We know he went through a lot of trials or tribulations, right? And a lot of people gloss over some of the dark things Job said, which we know as professionals, he had suicidal thoughts. And there are various verses where he mentioned wanting to die and wishing that he had died instead of going through what he's going through. And so just thinking about that, and you said it a little while ago, that people are suffering. Can you talk a little bit more about that, this aspect of suffering? Because I think when we look at it like that, from that perspective, that people are having these thoughts because they're suffering and they see that as an option. I don't think sometimes we grasp that, because sometimes when things happen, when people end their lives, we look at, oh, they were so happy, they seem so like they had everything going on, and I don't think we understand that aspect of suffering, that they were suffering. Can you talk a little bit about that based on your experience with this?
Well, I'd definitely say the first thing is that I believe that a lot of suffering comes from disconnection. So a person can seem happy, they can be giving, they can be, a lot of times they are generous, they're sensitive, they care deeply, they have a strong sense of right and wrong, so they might carry a tremendous amount of guilt. But that doesn't mean that they're connected. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean that they feel connected to you. And I believe personally that our first sense of connection, and our understanding of who God is as a little kid when we looked up at our parents and how they look back at us, right?
Mhm.
So our parents, in a sense, were like God, and because that's the way we can understand, this bigger sense of like this protector, this person who tells me what to do or what I can't do,
Mhm.
all of that. And then we began to see life through the lens of not just our parents, but parental like figures. And I would say that even includes leadership in the church, leadership in groups, leadership within a friendship group. And people need to know that those that we rely on for our safety, in a sense, even as adults, in that parental leadership position, that we're not being judged, that we are connected, that we are acceptable. And I believe that partially what makes it easier for it to happen is the level of shame that people have based on their fear of being judged by those that um, we perceive to have more power or to be powerful in our lives. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm thinking added to that sense of that stigma and that shame of feeling judged, of feeling like I can't get it together. Look at how successful I am. Look at how educated I am, how much money I have, and I can't get it together. I can't solve this, and I don't want people to see me like this or know this about me.
Yes.
What are they gonna think? What are they gonna know? So I like how you stated it. It's about connection, but meaningful connection, right? So if we had the right types of relationships with people where they know, hey, I can come to this person, I can talk to them, I can bear myself to them, and be loved and be accepted. You know, it sounds like it would change things for people, because as we look at this thing of suicide, we're all vulnerable to it. People think it's, oh, people are weak or they have mental illness, and certainly there are other factors, right? But we're all vulnerable to this under the right or wrong circumstance, right? As we talk about the experience of Job, everything was going okay one day, and the next day everything was falling apart. He lost everything, right? So under certain circumstances, we all become vulnerable to this. But I like how you're describing it. What I'm hearing at least is that it's an issue of connection. If we have the right type of connection with people,
And
when we're having these thoughts, when we're going through these experiences, we're able to seek help and support.
we're able to seek help. And I think I just want to add, because I think a powerful part of this and vital is normalizing suffering.
Mm.
As people often get uncomfortable when someone else comes around and they're suffering, like unless it's something super acceptable. Like we have things that we put in the realm of acceptable. Oh, you have a loss. Oh, we get why you might cry, but don't do that for too long. But if it's like a suffering that we struggle to define, a suffering that the person is struggling to define and understand, we tend to run from suffering. And I believe partially it's because we don't want to tap into our own suffering. And
Mm.
so it's like, or our own discomforts or our own questions. And so we disconnect, we get into a professional way of responding. And I'm not talking about only leaders as far as like church leaders or
Mhm.
parents, but also friendships. Like if you know that you have relationships with people who look up to you, they trust you, you have a certain amount of authority in their life, that's your sphere of influence. You don't have to be in a leadership position to be a leader. And so when people are suffering, they want to escape suffering. We all do. That's a normal experience. But I also believe that we need to normalize that that's part of life. The suffering is part of life, not in a sense to diminish their suffering, but that we don't have to carry shame because we're someone who's suffering.
Right. Right. I really like that. I think you're absolutely right with this thing on suffering. Often in my classes teaching, mental health counselors, we talk about empathy and sympathy, where, a lot of people display sympathy, but to empathy requires that you go there, that you do make yourself vulnerable. It does touch on your own suffering, your own vulnerabilities, and it's very uncomfortable. So you're absolutely right. If someone is crying, we immediately want to stop it. We immediately want to fix it. Hey, when life gives you lemons, you make some lemonade. I don't want to hear that right now. I want to cry about my lemons. I'm disappointed that life has given me lemons, and I should feel bad about that. I want to feel bad about that. It doesn't mean I'll always be in this space, but for now, for this moment, I am suffering. This is painful for me. This does not make me feel any joy, and I need an outlet. I need someone. I need to be able to say that without, immediate pushback. And we think we're doing good, and that's the thing, right? When we give people this advice when they're suffering, and we try to patch it up, gloss it over, I think it's more protective of us because we don't want to go there. We're discomforted by that. And so I think that's a very important piece that you're talking about, with regards to suffering, especially when people are having these thoughts as a resolution, as a solution, that we need to become comfortable with suffering, and that in life there's suffering regardless of different philosophical understandings or religious understandings. Suffering is part of this version of life. And
Right.
so I think it's very important. That's a very important point you're highlighting. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your own experience, your own story with suicide?
So in February 20, actually, of 2020, I lost my brother. We're 1 year apart. I lost him to suicide. And yeah, so I often think back, like, were there signs? And yeah, there were. And I remember it's really interesting how after things happen, you see things differently or you hear things differently. And sometimes it's just like the you don't know what's true or not. So I know that he talked about, his name was Antoine, to my mother, that he was suffering for years before he decided to take his life, and said to her, he didn't want to do it for me and her. He was the closest to us, and he didn't want to cause us suffering. And he said to her, do you want me to keep living so you don't suffer? And I'm
Mm.
suffering, and of course, you don't say, "Oh, well, yeah, I get it. I think you should just do that." No one's going to say that to their loved one. Um, but there are signs. Does that mean that you could stop it? It doesn't mean that you could stop it, but it does mean, in hindsight, I've gone through my own journey of not blaming myself. It's totally normal when someone takes their life that the people that are closest to them think that they, have a godlike power where they could stop things. But I do think that there are times where I wish um, that I was able to be there for him more. Right? I feel like we had a good relationship. I rarely even said no to my brother. I said we were like twins, even though we're 1 year apart. We never really fought. But I do remember a time where he called to talk to me and my husband about something, and there was a little bit of pushback for, I don't remember the exact reasons at the time, but I think that one of the lessons that I learned in hindsight is that a lot of times when people are close to being done, it's not that they're crying so much. It's not that they're talking so much. It's almost like that they're doing less of that, less talking, less crying, less, not that I ever really saw him cry, but generally speaking, less emotion about it. They're making peace with it. And I think that it would have been helpful to him and me whether or not he decided to make that decision in the end or not, that in that moment I was connected with him, that we hadn't backed away from a really uncomfortable conversation, because you don't know if that will help a person. And I do believe that connection will. So it's really complex because you're going to blame yourself and it's not your fault. It just isn't. People make the choices that they make for, you have to be in extreme pain because none of us like to hurt yourself. You're in extreme pain, right? And so, but what we can do is learn to do things in life that help us not to live with as much regret. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, yeah.
That-
You know, the one of the things you shared, and I think people don't get, because sometimes you'll hear people say, "Oh, that wasn't that was a selfish act of this individual," right? They did this. They hurt their family, they hurt their friends, their loved ones, and look at how their decision has impacted everyone. But to hear you say that he brought that up to your mom, hey, you're suffering because of my suffering. It's almost showing that side which I hadn't considered before, that hey, they might be doing this to end the suffering of their loved ones in their mind, at least, if I don't want them to worry anymore about me. And so this act is far from being selfish, right? It there's an aspect of, and it's weird to say this, but there's an aspect of love and sacrifice. Of course, we know that that is not the only solution, right? But at least it helps remove that stigma and that thought that, or that just being selfish. It's a simplistic way to understand something that's very complex.
Right, exactly. And I definitely would not, I don't think a person that makes that choice just made that choice, right? I think, I know it was like 5 years of my brother being different because he struggled with substance abuse. He hadn't always struggled with it, but he struggled with it. And I do remember him saying to me, if I do this one more time, I'm done. He was tired of struggling. And I just think if we think about our own lives, like if you're not an addict, extremely addicted to something. If your life is, you might have trauma, but it's not really extreme, we get tired of suffering, right?
Mhm.
So if you go through some very, very difficult things and you don't, and it just continues over time, some people's lives are just harder, and you can be a sibling and live with a person and your life still not be the same, your experiences still not be exactly the same, so that's one of the reasons I don't like when we compare, as far as like, oh well, they had the same parents. That no, you have different experiences in
Mhm.
life. That sometimes if we have strong feelings, it may not be to suicide, but we're depressed or we're really angry or we're, over things that are not as extreme, why would we think that a person who's going through extreme suffering on some level wouldn't have even a greater struggle, with accepting how life is?
Exactly,
So that's where
exactly.
that compassion comes
Yes, and more we're talking. I'm hearing that again. That I would phrase it that learning to love better. You know, that connectivity, that hey, allowing and being that space. And honestly, there's the individual perspective, there's the family perspective that you can create that, and there's still that social stigma and shame. But we just really need to be better at loving people, where especially we can love them in their worst.
in.
You know, uh, we often say, in church, that the church is a hospital, but the way we act sometimes does not reflect that, right? In the hospital, you have people in critical care. You have people in the ambulance that just bringing in because something bad has happened, right? Are we of space to allow for all of that? And like you mentioned, this wasn't like a flippant thing. This was years in the making. He was struggling with this stuff for years. And so what does that say about how often should we be there? And are we really up for the task of, being there, year after year after year, moment after moment after moment. And that more and more we're talking, this is what I'm hearing, and that it's a complicated thing, it's a complex thing, and you can do all of this, and unfortunately that individual still goes through with it. how
Mhm.
how did you deal with that, and where are you now in kind of recovering from that, and being hopeful, and all of that? How do you move on with your life when someone you love, someone you cares about, unfortunately does this?
Well, I want to say this before I answer that question. I do think that it's good to have boundaries, especially, like if somebody's addicted. My brother never let me see it. So it was still kind of a shock because he was very handsome, very good looking, look healthy, and didn't let us see him and his addiction. But, if you're dealing with somebody that's addicted, you don't want to become codependent where you're always trying to fix it. But it's more about in the moments where you're there, being present, being authentic, being honest, and I think that that's with good boundaries, but being honest, not putting on the suit of distance. That's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about connection. As far as where I'm at, I have to say I was really in a great position because I'm an entrepreneur, that I was able to mourn for a year and a half. I mean, I really didn't. And it also happened like around at the time of the pandemic. So I spent a lot of time at home, and I had the support of my husband. And I remember when it happened, the moment, because I had lost my father when I was in my 20s, and I was like struggling with how to deal with it, what I believed about life, my choices. And I remember thinking, okay, whatever's good in my life, the next time this happened, I'm going to keep doing that. I'm going to decide who I'm going to be in my suffering. And so it's kind of an extreme thing, but when it happened, I remember thinking, you better decide who you're going to be.
Mm.
And it was, I can remember the moment. I can remember the phone call from my mom and my husband answering and handing me the phone and hear her screaming that my brother shot himself. And I can remember just falling onto the floor. I remember everything like I was looking at myself, someone else's story, um, as it happened. And then saying, as I'm looking at myself, who are you going to be? And I decided I wanted to live. And that the thing that's so significant about that moment is, like I said, it's common when somebody takes their life for you to, for someone else in the family to think that's an option. My brother for me was, he understood me more than anybody in this world. My brother was my protector. He was my cheerleader. He helped me to draw. I like was not popular. I was a nerdy little sister, afraid to do everything. But because of him, I did things like I had my art in a museum. Um, my brother always, always, always said, "I'm proud of you," and nobody could like settle me down like my brother. So, and one of the funny things is when my husband met my brother, he's like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I met him sooner because I have a strong personality," right? And my brother said to me one time, I asked him to help me do something, and he said, "Okay, Kina, you asked me to help you do stuff, and then you take my hands and do it." And all I could do is laugh because he had a way of talking to me, he understood me and I understood him. And so for me, I felt like I lost a limb. I felt like
Mhm.
I lost a part of my body. Um, and I felt like, yes, I'm married, but my brother, my memories are with him,
Yes.
making Play-Doh, pizza, like just all memories from the beginning of my life with him.
Yeah.
So the journey was beginning to separate my life from his in a sense, which is a really hard thing to do. And realized that they were obviously, because I didn't know my brother was going to commit suicide, even though I knew he was suffering, and you just understand things in hindsight. There's no way you could know. And so I thought, I had to question, like, was I a good sister to him? He was a great brother to me. Was I good to him? And then like you don't want to let go of the person, right? And so suffering also kept him close, because it's like, I love you, I love you, I love you. It means something that you're not here. It means something. You will never be forgotten. You were important to somebody, to us. And I had to work through the process of realizing to love him is to live, and not just to not take my life, but to live. To live. My brother was always trying to tell me, I work so hard, you're always so focused, you don't enjoy life enough. And I learned lessons from his life. I learned lessons from what he told me, because he saw me. And I chose life. And that's how, and I mean really live. Like, yes, there's another life, all the things we believe, but this is the one we have now. And one way I can honor his life is to talk about this, so that maybe somebody else can understand that somebody sees you. Like, if you're suffering, somebody sees you, and that we can see the people that we love that are suffering. Like, think about just loving them. Like, when they're gone, that's it. You can't resolve it. It's unresolvable with that person. And live the best life that you possibly can for you and for your loved ones. That's what I got out of it. That's where I'm at. It made me more passionate about life and helping people to live the best life they can, because I think that that's what comes from suffering, comes from, is not living the best life you can for yourself.
Wow. Wow. That there's just so much. Then I really hope that people listening, people watching will take to heart all of the things you've shared. I want to center on a couple of things, this idea of deciding who you are going to be, that's, experiencing the loss of your dad, and gaining that perspective, if I could say, and I think that really prepared you for this happening in your life. And the last thing you said of to love him is to live, I think a lot of people, in essence, like you mentioned, blame themselves for this happening. I was there, or I could have been there. How could I have not seen? How could I? And there's so many things, but you said it best when you said, I know he had some of these things going on in his life, but of course I didn't know he was going to do. And that's the reality. We don't know, right? You don't know. And we see celebrities and people that, it's just always a shock, like, oh wow, we that's exactly the nature of it. But I really love that, to love him is to live, to go on. And as you were talking about your brother, and the pizza and the Play-Doh, and how, he spoke to you in a unique way, I saw that animation coming from you. I saw him. I saw that relationship. And it's something that people should remember. I think sometimes too, people are very angry with a loved one who does this, or a friend who does this. They're very angry with them. And that's part of the grieving process. But there's so much that they're angry at themselves, they're angry at that person for doing that. Why did they do something so stupid or whatever, you know? And I think it affects their ability to move on. And I hear you saying it. I love him. And to love him is to live. Like, that's how you're moving on. Like, it's unresolved, like you said. You will not understand, you don't understand the rationale, the mechanics and all of this. Like, but you don't have to. You can put a pin there, and hopefully in the in the life to come that's answered. But in the meantime, I'm gonna love him by living. I'm going to live, and I I see him being alive in you, and sharing your experience, his story, and um, and as we wrap up, what would you say to different groups of people? So, one, an individual who's contemplating
Uh-oh, I lost
suicide.
your sound.
Can
Your
you hear
sound
me?
is gone.
Okay.
Okay, now you're back. Okay.
Okay, good. So I want you to speak to two groups of people. One, an individual who's contemplating, suicide. Number two, family members or friends who have survived someone who's ended their life through suicide. What would you say to these two groups of people?
To someone who's thinking about suicide, I think what comes to mind immediately is that I would just listen to them. Because I think that sometimes when people just need to talk out there to get it out, the things that they're feeling and thinking. And then when we don't listen, what happens is they retain that. They never get to release it. And so it's just to listen and enter into their experience. Like we're talking about that empathy, but I mean, like, really take yourself out of yourself and just be present in their experience and just listen. Touch them if they're comfortable with it, because that's connection. And so that's something I would, if I had that situation in front of me again, that's what I would do. And that's what I would encourage people to do. Because sometimes when we're encouraging people not to, it makes them feel like you're diminishing their pain because you don't understand it. So then they swallow their pain, right? So that's the first thing. To somebody who is going through, can I add another category? Somebody who's going through, somebody's thinking about it. I would really say that you need to get your own support while you're dealing with a suicidal person, outside of them, therapy. I also believe that it's important to connect with them and not just talking about the problem, because it amplifies the problem. Not that we're ignoring it, but not just to focus on it, but to have experiences with them, to create memories with them, to be in relationship with them, and be your vulnerable yourself with them. And that could make a difference. Not that it will guarantee, but it could, because it's about connection and it's about people not feeling judged and shame and all those things. And that helps relieve some suffering. And then the last thing, for somebody who's already gone through that, I would say, don't be afraid to tell the truth. One of the things that I decided to do is I was not going to lie about how my brother died. Because first of all, I'm having a unique suffering experience because of suicide. And then I'm not going to let anybody force me to lie about what happened. I'm not doing that. And so be honest about your experience, because it creates more suffering. And you really, in your deep level of suffering, have a lot of power to control the trajectory of your family by how you suffer. And that might seem like a lot of pressure, but you don't want to take a situation that's already really sad and stressful and then create more of that, because now you haven't decided to live with more honesty, to be more connected, you're continuing a legacy in a sense of death, even though you're alive. And so I encourage people to let it make them better in life. Not that you were bad, but just more of connection, of God, of power. Let it do something for you and your family that's going to make your life better or somebody else's.
And thank you so much. Lastly, two things. The last aspect is, from a faith perspective, what would you say? There's so many aspects of this, and we don't have time to go through all of it. Is there anything you learned about God or your relationship with God change or was it affected by this? And just overall, that sense of faith
Ooh,
and connectivity with God, like what can you share about that aspect for yourself?
wow, that's a deep question. Okay, we don't have I will say this as simply as I can. We limit God by our own imagination of who he is and in the way that we're taught about God. We limit God's ability to love us, to heal. I don't really believe in healing. I believe in integration, honestly. I believe that we take these experiences and we become who we decide to be with God's help. Not necessarily you heal, you're changed. But I believe that God does not see any of this the way that we see it. I just don't believe that. I believe that God entered into that experience with my brother. While he was there, he was with him. In our suffering, he's with us. God is somebody who understands suffering more than we understand suffering. I'm sorry for my dog. And so spiritually, my belief about God is expansive. And I think that if we really, really, really want to understand God, instead of the focus and emphasis and our emotions being put on the 10 Commandments, we need to focus on what he's saying about love, because it helps us. It truly is the foundation of everything else. It helps us to understand everything else. Everything else. Am I living an example of God's love? Whether I'm talking about commandments, whether I'm talking about suicide, whether I'm listening to a teenager or an adult that frustrates me, am I embodying the power that comes from understanding what it means to love a human, to love them and not wait till it's tragic, right? To understand what it means to love. So I believe that God's love has been diminished in a lot of our spiritual experiences and replaced with so many things that aren't that. And that this has helped me to understand, like, when you go to the depths of loss, that is so important to love people. And to me, that's not just sweet and kind and I love you and bumper stickers. That is empathy. That is being real with ourselves and living in honesty. That is connection. That's what I believe.
Oh, well, and then again, it comes back full circle what you were talking about earlier, that connection, love. And again, we need to do a better job with loving. We really do. Thank you so much for sharing this experience. I know it's going to be a blessing to so many people. And you have suffered through it, but as I can tell, as we can see, that it's like you said, you've integrated it into your being, your existence, and it shows. It shows. So thank you so much. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, knowing what you do, you introduced yourself to us earlier. How can people reach you or follow you or check in and see what you're doing? It seems like you've integrated all of these things into your being, and I just think that there's so many people who need to hear what you're saying and who need to see what you're doing to, as a way to help them navigate their own life. So how can people do that?
Well, I'm Sakina Tennyson all over social media, and I'm mainly on Facebook and Instagram. And I do like to share my life, because one of the things that happened after all this went down is I always wanted to live in the country, and that's what I'm doing. So we're beekeeping, we have chickens, we're doing all that. And so I like to encourage people to live the best life possible. And I really believe that that's what God wants for us, because it makes us better human beings to other people. It's not selfish. It's like, now I have more to offer, right? And so that's what they can do, is they can follow me on social, Instagram and Facebook, talk to me, DM me. I've had people DM me about suicide. I have made friendships from other people who have gone through this. I'm so willing to talk, and just know that even if nobody in your personal world understands, in the vast world, there are people who understand you. That there are people that understand you, and you ask God to bring them in your life.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.